I'm going to be firing things bullet-like. It's intent to get some things on the table and maybe begin processing. Maybe at some point with some other opportunity, I have a chance to expand upon what I'm talking about here. But I just wanted to get some things out and begin the processing. Now, I've been asked to deal with political participation as a reconciling community, theological reflections, and I wanted to just quickly begin with situating myself, telling you a little bit about my background. Nobody comes to Scripture, nobody comes to the discipline of theology, for example, with a blank slate. There's certain things that you're alerted to because of your background. But I can only mention a couple of things because they interface with this political dimension. Actually started getting an awareness of this in high school. Senior year, we had a time of cooperation with our crosstown rival in actuality. But some students there walked out of their school because, some black students walked out of it because they felt there was not insufficient amount of black literature and black authors represented in the library, and they wanted to draw attention to it, so they came over our way. We, in cooperation, many of us also walked out of school at that time, meeting with the principals a little bit later on. But political engagement with power sometimes comes with a price. Previously, through my junior high, 7th through 9th grade at that time, I had 3 years of perfect attendance at school. And I had the same through high school too, 10th through 12th, except for this one day when I walked out and they refused to give me an award for attendance. So it's just a little small thing to say that, power engagement can be positive, but you sometimes pay a price. A little bit later on, when I was a freshman in undergrad, I began to be exposed to writings such as Bobby Seale's work, one of the founders of the Black Panthers, Seize the Time. Eldridge Cleaver, the Minister of Information, then with his Soul on Ice, the autobiography of Malcolm X, and also a collection of his speeches I had some exposure to. And there were other writers that I encountered during this time. And although I'm not making this up when I would say that during the spring of that year, I actually thought that checking out the Panthers would be a good move, because I was convinced that something needed to be done, and what's the best way to go about doing it. Something had to be done, but the question is, what's the best way to go about doing it? So I had an address in West Philadelphia, but unfortunately when I went there, it was a wrong address, and we didn't actually go to the headquarters, but then by the time I got back to my room, I had done some rethinking of matters and proceeded accordingly. Next turning point, just before we get into some of the particulars in the outline, coming here after 3 years with the MDiv, finally hearing something about liberation theology. And related to that, black theology, and the name James Cone, and black theology and black power. What is this? Because I haven't heard these through my 3 years, MDiv. But we had some exposure through my THM year writing on Cone's soteriology. Just a few turning points to alert you to what I bring to this discussion. There's a whole lot more, but I just want to try to hit a few points here. But by way of introduction, some important definitions. We hear the term politics. Activities that relate to influencing the actions and policies of government, or getting and keeping power in government. Working definition, working understanding. Could a whole lot more be said on this point alone? Yes. Unfortunately, we can't do that. Reconciliation. What are we talking about? Basically, it may be defined as the restoration of fellowship between estranged parties. May I say, though, difficult to do if you're too ensconced in one community as compared to another. Reconciliation involves a kind of achieving a middle ground in order to bring people together. And that's sometimes hard to come by, particularly in these days. But wanted to have some beginning understandings of terminology, and just say, because I want to try to minimize expectations here. I know some of you are thinking, well, Dr. Fields is coming here through biblical and theological engagement to reinforce what I already believe, or to come up with some answers, A, B, C, D, program. No, sorry. For if you'll observe that with the next point, these are matters in the realm of wisdom and discernment that we're actually dealing with. It would be nice if there was A, B, C, D, including in whatever the position is, but may I say that for believers, that's not reality. Ours is much more complex in terms of what we have to deal with. Structure of presentation, I'm going to offer the beginnings of theological framework. This is an experiment. This is a model. This is proposal of how to think, how to process. It's not the answer, but it is a proposal to say, here's the way that we can begin to go about thinking about things, incorporating theological perspectives, exploring meaning, significance against that backdrop. So, I'm going to be trying to construct a theological framework, making references to points from the doctrines of humanity and ecclesiology, the church. Could the other doctrines easily be brought in? Of course they can. But this is just exposure. I want to bring them to the matter of political engagement just briefly, just principially, just for some reflection. But then I want to mention a few points on the matter of biblical parameters of justice, because that's hot these days. Big time hot. Okay, I'm with that. I got that. But it'd be interesting to deal with some things connected with this from a biblical perspective, just for exposure's sake. So let me begin with the theological construction considerations from the realm of the doctrine of humanity, particularly the area of the image of God and its meaning. How does that affect? What does that equip us to think in terms of the engagement with the political? Because there you're talking about community, you're talking about laws and policies, and you're talking about power. And people do not simply divest themselves of power and influence. Do not become naive about that. People do not simply give up power. And if it appears that they do, I didn't intend to do this, I'm sorry. It may result in further control of you. Okay, I'm sorry. That's not in my notes here, sorry. Image, reflect who God is, what God is like. Something that a person is. We are image bearers of God. You are, I am, image bearers of God. Which leads me then to a consideration of the matter of dignity. Now, other topics could easily be subsumed, but I want to talk a little bit about dignity stemming from, related to, our imaging of God. It is, for example, something that that a human being is entitled to. It's the state or quality of being worthy of honor or respect. It's something we're entitled to. It's something that we reinforce further when functioning like God in creativity, stewardship in creation, and in relationships. Relationships are also a stewardship, you see. And productivity, development of resources. Productivity, that too is part of the functioning of imaging. But let me just mention one other thing, though, in terms of our imaging. We are fallen. I hate to be a wet blanket. Y'all are so nice. You're listening very intently and really want you to feel good. I want you to like me by the time I'm done. I really do, but... Now, what does this have to do with this whole imaging thing? Well, we are majestic creations, worthy of dignity that can be reinforced by what we do, particularly in line of God's will. But fallenness speaks of the pervasiveness of sin in us and through us, even in the church. Manifested in all human institutions, it shows up. Thus, anything that we do, no matter how well motivated, how noble the motivation, it is not perfect and it will not last. Can I say that here? We are image bearers of God, worthy, entitled to dignity. But we just got this problem. And we carry the problem into whatever we do, no matter how noble the endeavor. I don't say that to discourage you, but as our brother Josh brought up earlier, speaking of God, I need you, we will always be in need of God. Period. End of quotation marks. Count on it. Take it to the bank. Whatever you see is sure. But in God, we can do great things. Now, just a few reflections from the realm of ecclesiology, this study of the consideration of the doctrine of the church. I like the term from the King James Version that we are a peculiar people. All right? Now, other versions, like the English Standard Version, say they are people for his own possession. That captures it nicely, but we're different, or at least we should be. You see, and a lead into that kind of peculiarity, for want of a better word. Philippians 3:20 reminds us, but our citizenship is in heaven, and from it we await a Savior, the Lord Jesus Christ. We are a peculiar people who understand that our identity is first and foremost founded from a heavenly perspective. Now, don't get me wrong. This is not intended to belittle the gifts of race, ethnicity, gender, traditions. These are all important matters that should be embraced, appreciated as manifestations of God's creativity. Okay? But the social cultural constructs that emerge from the interface of these factors are not the only things that define our identity as believers. We're always walking in attention. We're walking in appreciation for who and what we are and our uniqueness. And yet, we are concurrently citizens of heaven. Matter of how do I think of, how do I conceive of myself, how do we conceive of one another? If you neglect the heavenly dimension, then you become at the mercy of the powers that be around you. For that is to say that thus we are truly in the world, participating in all good involvements, including the political. But we are not of the world, meaning ruled by worldly systems. I think you're beginning to see why I place these kinds of reflections in the area of wisdom and discernment. We need God to properly process all that is involved in this realm of political engagement that brings healing, that brings people together. It doesn't just happen. And no political construct can guarantee a coming together. For even if it's imposed by law, eventually what is here is going to be manifested. If the law suits me, I live with it. But if it doesn't, then eventually we will find a way to change it. We're trying to stay straight here. Okay, implications for reconciliatory engagement with the political. Questions you ask: do political constructs recognize the dignity of human beings? Does it recognize our innate nobility? Or does it treat it like objects, pieces of a machine? That which is to be herded like cattle. In my evaluation of political engagement, I'm keeping this in mind. Does it facilitate the functioning of image bearers, creativity, productivity, facilitating not only survival but also reinforcement of dignity through achievement? Letting people express their gifts, Let them become all that they can become. Let them do what they are capable of doing, again, for the sake of community, for the sake of the wholeness of the community. To put a matter on the line, get a card out. I throw cards, sometimes grenades. But deliberate denial of work, deliberate denial of achievement, for example, may very well be a human rights issue. Because as image bearers, should be allowed freedom of creativity and expression. Or denial of these kinds of things can facilitate more control by governmental powers. I'm just thinking now, I also happen to have, my bloodlines are all over the place, can I say. And if 10, 15 years ago, I probably wouldn't have admitted that, but I've got, not only the African streams, but I've also got Choctaw and Cherokee, and I know about these kinds of developments in our country. And just think about it, the governmental programs of taking people off their land and replenishing the buffalo population, which provided food, shelter, all kinds of things, and the capacity to just live life. We're going to put you on a situation where you can't survive by yourself, and we will provide for you. But in the process, because you cannot do what you're capable of doing, we will control you. I've also read books on Native American life and history and these kinds of things too. Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee by D. Brown. Okay, I'm sorry, I'm getting stuck here. But recognizing our image bearing. Does a system allow the church to be the church? Ministry of the gospel accomplished within the context of religious freedom in our country do have to allow for religious expression. In the midst of that religious expression, will you allow us to be the church of Jesus Christ and all that entails? Does that governmental system allow this? Now, we're not aiming, as Dr. Sweeney talked about, right, looking at his fine presentation, not talking about the establishment of Christendom, where there's a hand-in-glove relationship between governmental power and the church, though we can have presence in the government. We're not seeking to build a Christian kingdom, but having a pervasive presence in all dimensions of society, being everywhere present as believers, and serving and engaging in these kinds of things. We can do that, you see. But this kind of distinction between pervasive presence and the avoidance of Christendom allows us to maintain also concurrently a prophetic stance. Because sometimes government, laws, and policies move in wrong directions. If you're too engaged in the political realm, you lose the capacity to speak correctively to the structures. But overall, does a political system allow us to be the church? And the last thing I just wanted to say here in this regard is we were just drawing some implications to the political realm. If entrusted with political power, believers, if entrusted with political power, the making of laws, policies, and the like, we hold the power with open palms, not to be grasped, not to be seized, not necessarily to be maintained. That's what the world does. We're entrusted to serve, entrusted to empower others, entrusted to lift up others if we're involved in the realm of political engagement. Now, a quick reflection on justice. Very easily to deal with. But, much of our understanding and implementation is influenced by Aristotelian definition, render to one his or her due. Very simply put, and although the matter of justice is much broader than that, still, there is a pervasive understanding of justice accomplished when we render to the other or to others what is due them, okay? But then, to complicate things, what specifically is due is a complicated matter. And it is one that leaves room for all kinds of assessments, all kinds of people making determination of what is due to the other. So that's much of what we function other in some form or fashion. But when you start dealing with justice from the biblical perspective, things get very, very haywire very quickly. I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, well, prophets, lifting up widows and orphans and not stealing land, not moving markers of land. I'm with that. I'm tracking with you on that, okay? But here's where wisdom and discernment also enters in. You see, as one writer would put it, there's a strong evidence that the verb in terms of to justify refers to actions that help restore balance or wholeness. The term used, shalom, peace, harmony, wholeness to community, and then when exercised by God, reference a strong divine moral influence in the structure and governance of creation itself. All right? So justice is intimately related to what we oftentimes assume to be shalom, peace, harmony, balance within a community. It isn't just giving to him or her his or her due. That's more of a standard, that's more of a kind of hope for achievement. But justice, when you deal with it biblically, is much more than that. And for us, believers and those in the temporal setting, there's always a tension between seeming postponement of justice and the insistence on immediate fulfillment. Just a case in point. I remember around the time that I was beginning this exposure to more militant writings, freshman year, undergrad, you heard about Dr. King's Southern Christian Leadership Conference, but also Stokely Carmichael's formation of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and how and why that would emerge. Whereas Dr. King, under the influence of others such as Mahatma Gandhi, was going to involve themselves in peaceful resistance, Stokely Carmichael would give testimony to the fact that, we saw the dogs, we saw the hoses, we saw all that was damaging to us, the lynchings and the like, and we are not going to put up with it anymore. So you see, even in the movement that we call the achievement of civil rights, there could be evidences of a division. There were some that were intent on the long haul approach, but then there were others saying, in this long haul, that ain't cutting it. That's not making it. We got to do something immediate. Got to bring about change more quickly. And to be honest with you, how do you go about adjudicating between these approaches, really, okay? Especially when, under Dr. Cohn's influence, a passage like Exodus 3:9, and now behold, the cry of the people of Israel has come to me, and I've also seen the oppression with which the Egyptians oppressed them. And Exodus, finally judgment, justice, new beginnings. Now, okay? But God waited 400 years. In that time, literally millions died, never seeing the freedom. Is that justice? Is that right? Or, in the case of the United States, over 250 years officially, lawfully of slavery. Finally, the Emancipation Proclamation comes up freeing the slaves in the Confederate States. It's a whole other narrative, a whole other story. Millions died in the meantime. Was it just? Was it fair to them? All the more reason why I had incorporated earlier the statement there, until I entered the sanctuary of God. You remember there that in Psalm 73, the psalmist was struggling with, why is it that the rich seem to prosper even though they're evil and they do wrong things. And I'm trying to live for you all the time, and I get chastened all the time. This was confusing to me until I entered the sanctuary of God. Then I understood their end, you see. We need God. We need to periodically enter into the sanctuary of God because from our perspective, things that we see as just and right, well, don't assume that God sees it the same way at the same time. That's the wet blanket that I am today. I'm sorry. But for example, to be engaged in some forms of group protest, I can only say, as you proceed, you think about with what attitude? What's driving you? What's your motivation? Because if you're not careful, you can become like your oppressor, and you don't even know it. What is the motivation? What is the end you're trying to achieve through said involvement? Are you taking the time to prayerfully consider that? Motivation, because if you're going about things with the wrong motivation, believe me, it's all going to come back on you in some form or fashion. What are the ends you're aiming for and why? Okay? So with that, I did not bring forth much in terms of particularity, but I was trying to demonstrate how theological engagement can lead to informing on. I don't say that it gives you point A, B, C, and D. Rather, it's the realm of wisdom and discernment. With that, you also have some questions on the sheets. I want to invite you then to transition to trying to make sense of them. Thank you for listening.